Parable I read this morning is actually one of my favorites. Many of us have heard it before many times. Part of the reason it's one of my favorites is it's beautifully poetic in its own way. When I was hungry, you fed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me drink. When I was a stranger, you welcomed me. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was sick, you visited me. When I was in prison, you came to see me. It's beautifully poetic and musical. Another reason I always like this parable is it seems very concrete. All I have to do to be one of the sheep is feed the hungry and bring water to the thirsty and visit those in prison who are sick, clothe the naked. It seems concrete actions which can show my faithfulness. And I must confess this morning that one other reason I like it is it actually is a nice way to polarize the world, if you will, to separate out the goats and the sheep. It's a nice way to know who the good guys are and who the bad guys are, right? The good guys, they help the hungry and thirsty, the naked, those who are sick and in prison. The bad guys, they don't even notice them, right? They don't even see them. And there's something appealing about that there's a sense in which there will be a day in which people are separated, and the good guys, which, by the way, obviously I'm part of the good guys. I go down to the homeless shelter, I serve food, right? I'm going to get a gift off the giving tree. And then it separates out those who don't do such things, the unfaithful. And that's appealing. There's no better feeling, I must confess, than feeling self-righteous, right? Go down to that homeless shelter and serve, and I feel I'm part of the sheep. I'm there. There's something simple about that. There's something concrete about that. Years ago, as I was beginning my ministry as associate pastor at a church in Oklahoma, in Stillwater, Oklahoma, and we invited a gentleman, a really unique person. His name was Noah Snyder. We invited him to come speak to our church, and Mr. Snyder had written a book called When There Is No Place Like Home, an autobiography of homelessness. And what he shared, what he found, what was most interesting about him was that he shared his own story of homelessness. It's not often a story we get to hear very often. About his own gradual slide through lost jobs and medical issues and even some wrong choices and just bad luck, ended up on the street. And he shared in this in a very powerful way, a simple way, he shared trying to survive in those streets and the choices you have to make. And it was really fascinating. Interesting to hear. But then he shared, he says, what he experienced in those streets, something I had never heard before or even thought about a homeless person. He talked about his shame. He talked about how ashamed he was that he had failed so badly. That it was almost a barrier to him trying to find a way forward. And I remember thinking to myself, and I remember in getting to know him, I kind of for the first time got a glimpse into the soul of someone broken and vulnerable. And I thought to myself, all these years I've never really understood. I've I've tried to help people. I volunteered down at the homeless shelter. I've brought stuff for cross ministries, but I've never really encountered and saw into the heart of someone so vulnerable. And how did I miss it? How did I not see it? It's a question, I'll be honest, I still struggle with today. Now, unfortunately, though I'd like this parable to be about how people are divided between the good guys and the bad guys, those who love the poor and those who don't, that doesn't really fit who Jesus was. He was not necessarily a polarizing figure in which he assigned certain people to be good and certain people to be bad. In fact, he was always reaching out and connecting people, rich and poor, male and female, Gentile and Jew. So in some ways, I worry that reading into this story, this example, this idea of people of separation, that there are some good people and some bad people, doesn't really fit the vision and ministry and life of Jesus. And so I wonder if this parable is more about that every single one of us in here has part of the sheep and is part goat. That every single one of us maybe sees the vulnerable and helps them, and every single one of us, and this is the question that haunts me, every single one of us in our lives doesn't even notice the vulnerable around us. And that is the question that haunts me from this text, this Bible story, this parable. How often do I walk through life and not see the vulnerable around me? It wasn't that they chose not to help, I don't think. It was that they couldn't even see them. And I wonder what keeps us from seeing the vulnerable around us. Part of it, I think, in some ways, is we're just so busy, right? Who has time to notice? I'm busy with my life. I got work to do. I've got things to get accomplished. I can't really notice those who are vulnerable. Or maybe I don't really want to notice, right? Maybe I'm afraid of vulnerability. We live in a culture and a society that teaches us that to be vulnerable is almost a moral failing, right? A society and culture that teaches us vulnerable people are people to be frightened of. The hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the sick, the imprisoned. I can give you example after example of example how we are told avoid them at all costs. So I think in some ways we go through life not really wanting to see those who are vulnerable. But then I also think, in many times in our lives, as we go through our lives, we don't expect to see them. I mean, there are those intentional times we might go into those parts of town where there might be vulnerable people. In fact, when we volunteer and do some mission and work for the church, we intend and expect to see such people. But what if we go through life and we just don't expect to see them because we don't expect them to be in our own lives? The challenge of this story, of seeing the radical notion of this story, is that Jesus is in and part of the most vulnerable in our lives. And yet, we don't see him. Now, I'll be honest, as I've thought about this, I think part of the problem of why we have a hard time seeing Jesus and the vulnerable around us is because we have certain ideas about church and discipleship that get in our way. If you really want to think about it. We tend to think church is where we go do mission, right? Well, I volunteer at church, and I go down to the homeless shelter, or I bring stuff for cross ministries, or I get a card from Giving Tree. That's my paying attention to the vulnerable. Therefore, in some ways, that vision of church actually prevents us from seeing Jesus in our everyday life. Because we think church is coming to church rather than the church on Sunday, that we volunteer to do the mission and ministry, when the truth is, every single day church is not something we go to. Every single day, you are the church. Every single day. Church isn't just Sunday morning, it's Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday, and I'm not telling you have to be at the homeless shelter every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday to encounter the vulnerable. What I'm telling you, I think something we ought to think about, is that every day we encounter somebody who's hungry and thirsty, who's a stranger, who's in prison. Every day, we walk right by them. And that's the challenge of this story, those of us who are sheep and goats, is that we don't see Jesus in the people around us, in the vulnerable people around us. It is right and good that we should be going down to the homeless shelter. It's right and good we should be going down and ministering among those in cross ministry. But those are only small examples of the ways in which we should see Christ in the vulnerable around us. Because I promise you, there are people at work who are hungry for something, for meaning, for possibility. I promise you that your own kids are thirsty. I worry about this when my kids were growing up, that they were thirsty for my attention, but I was too busy, providing for and taking care of them. And really, I should have given the best of what I was. There are strangers in your life who are looking, who are lonely, who want connection. Maybe a neighbor's moved in next door. And that's the opportunity to see Christ in them. So this isn't, in hearing this parable, this isn't necessarily a commandment to divide the world up into sheep and goats. It's not a commandment for you to feel bad if you haven't done or ministered to the vulnerable. It's not a commandment in any way. It is a blessing. Because what Jesus says is that it's in the vulnerable people around us that He is there. So it's not just an invitation to serve, it's an invitation to a moment of holiness in which we see Jesus. And so while we may embrace the vulnerable, the hungry, and the poor, both physically and metaphorically, it is a call to us to be blessed in seeing Jesus amidst those vulnerable people. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.